Christmas night, 1943. The Arctic Ocean is a frozen hell, waves crashing against steel as snow tears through the darkness. Somewhere in that chaos, one of Germany's most powerful warships is about to meet its end. The Scharnhorst, a battleship that had cheated death more times than anyone could count, was finally running out of luck. But here's the thing nobody talks about. This wasn't just bad luck. This was a disaster waiting to happen, orchestrated by a series of decisions so questionable that historians are still arguing about them 80 years later. They called her Das glückhafte Schiff, the lucky ship. She'd survived mine strikes that should have torn her apart, dodged air raids that sank her sister ships, and pulled off escapes that seemed impossible. But on this frozen Christmas night, surrounded by British guns in the pitch-black Arctic waters, all that luck was about to run dry. And the man standing on her bridge, he never should have been there in the first place. What really happened during those final hours? Was this a brilliant British trap or a German command failure? And why was a destroyer expert commanding one of the most powerful battleships in the Kriegsmarine on what everyone suspected was a one-way mission? The answers are more disturbing than you might think. The Scharnhorst wasn't just any battleship. By 1943, she'd become something of a legend in the Kriegsmarine, and not just because of her firepower. This ship had a habit of surviving situations that would have sent any other vessel to the bottom of the ocean. Sailors whispered about her luck, and even the British knew her reputation. She was fast, she was deadly, and somehow she always made it home. Her most famous escape came in February 1942 during what the British called the Channel Dash. Scharnhorst, along with her sister ship Gneisenau and the heavy cruiser Prince Eugen, had to break out of the French port of Brest and make a run through the English Channel back to Germany. The British threw everything at them: coastal batteries, torpedo bombers, destroyers. It should have been a massacre. Instead, Scharnhorst sailed right through the heart of British defenses in broad daylight. But here's where it gets wild. During that dash, Scharnhorst hit not one, but two mines. The first explosion rocked the ship so hard that she came to a complete stop, dead in the water just miles from the British coast. The crew worked frantically, got her moving again, and then, bang, she hit another mine. Again, the ship shuddered to a halt. Again, somehow, the engineers got her running. She limped back to port, damaged but alive. Any other ship would have been done. Scharnhorst just kept going. Throughout 1942 and early 1943, she survived air raids in Norwegian fjords, dodged submarine attacks, and participated in raids against Allied convoys. Every time the British thought they had her cornered, she'd slip away into the Arctic mist. Her crew started believing she was genuinely unsinkable. Officers who served on her talked about the ship like she had a will of her own, like she wanted to survive. But there's a dark side to that kind of thinking, because when you start believing in luck, you stop preparing for the moment when it runs out. And for Scharnhorst, that moment was coming fast. Reports from her final weeks suggest something had changed. Mechanical issues were piling up. The ship needed a proper overhaul, but kept getting sent on missions instead. Some crew members later claimed they felt different about this particular deployment, like the ship's luck had finally turned. One survivor allegedly said the atmosphere on board felt heavy in the days before Christmas 1943. Maybe they sensed what was coming. Now here's where things get really questionable. Admiral Erich Bey was a good officer. Nobody disputes that. But he was a destroyer commander. His entire career had been built on leading small, fast ships in quick, aggressive actions. He knew destroyers inside and out, understood their tactics, their limitations, their strengths. What he didn't know was how to command a battleship. And that's exactly what the German High Command put him in charge of. Bey himself knew it was a problem. There's a quote from him that says everything you need to know. The last time I was aboard a capital ship, it was as a cadet. Think about that for a second. The man responsible for commanding one of Germany's most powerful warships hadn't served on one since he was a trainee. It would be like putting a fighter pilot in command of a bomber squadron and expecting him to figure it out on the fly. It doesn't make sense. He'd only been in the position for a few weeks, replacing Admiral Kummetz after some political shuffle in the naval command. Bey didn't ask for this job. Some reports claim he actively tried to avoid it, knowing he wasn't the right fit. But orders were orders, and in December 1943, the German military wasn't exactly in a position to be picky about assignments, so Bey took command of a battle group he barely understood, operating a ship he had minimal experience with. It gets worse. When Bey took over, several experienced staff officers who knew the Scharnhorst were reassigned. He was left with a team that was just as unfamiliar with capital ship operations as he was. The institutional knowledge that should have been there, the understanding of how Scharnhorst handled in rough seas, how to maximize her speed advantage, when to engage and when to run, all of that walked out the door with the previous staff. Bey was essentially starting from scratch. There are rumors that Bey was bitter about the whole situation. Some historians suggest he saw this assignment as a form of exile, a way for higher-ups to sideline him. Whether that's true or not, what's certain is that Bey had serious doubts about taking Scharnhorst into combat. He reportedly tried to get the Christmas mission canceled, citing the terrible weather and poor visibility. His concerns were ignored. The orders came from the top, and Grand Admiral Dönitz himself was pushing for action. Bey had no choice but to follow through. So on Christmas Day 1943, a destroyer expert who barely knew his own ship was about to lead it into one of the most dangerous naval operations of the war. The lucky ship was in the hands of a commander who'd been set up to fail. And the British were waiting. Christmas Day 1943. While families across Europe were trying to find some small moment of peace in the middle of a brutal war, Grand Admiral Dönitz was ordering the Scharnhorst into action. The target was Convoy JW-55B, a group of merchant ships carrying supplies to the Soviet Union. On paper, it seemed like a perfect opportunity. Slow-moving cargo vessels protected by a few escort ships. Scharnhorst could tear through them and be back in port before the British even knew what happened. Except nothing about this mission was that simple. The weather alone should have been enough to call it off. Arctic storms in December are absolutely vicious, with waves that can snap a destroyer in half and visibility so poor you can't see your own bow. Bey knew this. He sent multiple messages back to command expressing his concerns. The conditions were beyond dangerous. They were suicidal. But Dönitz wasn't hearing it. He wanted action. The Kriegsmarine had been too passive, too cautious, and it was making Hitler furious. Something had to be done, and Scharnhorst was the only ship available. Here's the thing, though. Scharnhorst wasn't supposed to be alone. Her sister ship, Tirpitz, should have been there to back her up. But Tirpitz had been damaged in a British midget submarine attack back in September and was still under repair. That left Scharnhorst as the only battleship operational in Norway. It was the first time she'd be sailing into major combat without support from another capital ship. The crew knew it. Bey knew it. And there's evidence suggesting that made everyone extremely uneasy. Then there's the manning issue. Because it was Christmas, a significant portion of the crew was on leave. The ship went into battle undermanned, with some stations filled by sailors who'd never worked those positions before. It wasn't a full crew operating at peak efficiency. It was whoever happened to be on board when the orders came through. That's not how you send a battleship into combat, but again, Dönitz was insistent. The mission had to happen now. Dönitz sent Bey a message that's been analyzed and debated ever since. I believe in your attacking spirit. On the surface, it sounds like encouragement, but read between the lines and it's a threat. It's saying, I expect you to attack no matter what, and if you don't, there will be consequences. Bey wasn't being given operational flexibility. He was being told to charge forward regardless of the situation. That's not strategy. That's desperation. And here's the real kicker. British intelligence already knew they were coming. The codebreakers at Bletchley Park had intercepted German communications. Admiral Fraser and the Royal Navy knew Scharnhorst was leaving port. They knew her likely course, and they had time to position their ships exactly where they needed to be. Bey was sailing into a trap that had been set days earlier, and nobody on the German side had any idea. The lucky ship was about to sail straight into the jaws of the most carefully planned ambush of the war. So when Scharnhorst left port on Christmas Day with her inexperienced commander, undermanned crew, and no backup. She wasn't heading out on a raid. She was heading to her execution. The only question was how long she'd last. The morning of December 26th came with exactly the kind of weather Bey had warned about. Visibility was near zero, snow was coming down sideways, and the seas were so rough that even experienced sailors were getting tossed around. Scharnhorst was plowing through the Arctic darkness, searching for the convoy. Bey had 5 destroyers with him, but in these conditions, keeping the formation together was nearly impossible. Ships would disappear into the snow squalls and reappear minutes later miles off course. It was chaos. What Bey didn't know was that HMS Belfast, one of the British cruisers shadowing the convoy, had picked up Scharnhorst on radar at a distance of 35,000 yards. That's nearly 20 miles. The British had a massive technological advantage here. Their radar could see through the storm, through the darkness, through everything that was blinding the Germans. Scharnhorst was sailing blind, while the British watched her every move. The British cruisers, Belfast, Sheffield, and Norfolk, moved to intercept. They closed the distance carefully, using the storm as cover, waiting for the perfect moment. Then, just after 9:30 in the morning, star shells lit up the sky. For the Germans, it was like someone had just turned on stadium lights in the middle of a blackout. 1 second, they're alone in the storm. The next second, the horizon is blazing with light, and British guns are opening fire. Scharnhorst's crew scrambled to battle stations as shells started landing around them. They returned fire, but they were shooting at muzzle flashes in a snowstorm. The British had radar-directed fire control. They could aim with precision even when they couldn't see their target. The Germans were basically guessing. And then it happened. A shell from HMS Norfolk smashed directly into Scharnhorst's forward radar array, completely destroying it. The ship's electronic eyes were gone. Now they were truly blind. Bey made a decision in that moment that historians still argue about. He ordered his 5 destroyers to break off and search for the convoy on their own, while Scharnhorst turned south to escape the British cruisers. On paper, it makes sense. Spread out your forces, divide the enemy's attention, find the target. But in reality, in a storm this bad, those destroyers were never going to find their way back. Bey had just sent away his only backup, leaving Scharnhorst completely alone. The British cruisers chased after Scharnhorst, firing as they went, scoring a few more hits but nothing critical. Bey's ship was faster, and gradually the distance between them started to open up. The crew on Scharnhorst actually started to relax a little. They'd taken some damage, sure, but they were pulling away. Maybe the luck was still holding. Maybe they'd make it back to port after all. What they didn't realize was that breaking contact with those cruisers was the worst thing that could have happened, because now Scharnhorst was running south at full speed, right into the second part of the British trap. And waiting there in the darkness was something far more dangerous than a few cruisers. HMS Duke of York, one of Britain's most powerful battleships, was positioned perfectly across Scharnhorst's escape route. Admiral Fraser had been tracking the entire battle on radar, watching Scharnhorst run straight toward him. The trap was working perfectly. Bey thought he was escaping. He had no idea he was about to sail directly into the guns of the one ship that could actually destroy him. The lucky ship's luck had just run out, and nobody on board even knew it yet. Admiral Sir Bruce Fraser was not the kind of man who left things to chance. As commander-in-chief of the home fleet, he'd been hunting Scharnhorst for months, waiting for the perfect opportunity to destroy her. And now, on this freezing December night, he had her exactly where he wanted her. Fraser was personally commanding HMS Duke of York, and he'd positioned his battleship directly in Scharnhorst's path. This wasn't luck. This was calculated, methodical planning. And it was about to pay off. Duke of York's radar operators watched their screens as the contact got closer. 35,000 yards. Scharnhorst was still racing south, completely unaware of what was waiting ahead. Fraser gave quiet orders to his crew, keeping everything calm and controlled. There was no rush. Let the prey come to them. 30,000 yards. The distance was closing steadily. Scharnhorst was making nearly 30 knots, desperate to get away from the cruisers behind her, sailing straight into the ambush. 20,000 yards. Fraser's gun crews were ready, but he held them back. Patience. In naval warfare, the first ship to fire gives away its position. Fraser wanted to get close enough that missing would be impossible. His officers watched him, waiting for the order, but Fraser just stood there, stone-faced, watching the numbers tick down. 11,000 yards. That's just over 6 miles. In naval terms, that's point-blank range for a battleship. Fraser finally spoke. Take aim. Duke of York's massive turrets, each armed with 14-inch guns that could punch through 2 feet of steel, slowly rotated toward their target. The gun crews made final adjustments, checking ranges, calculating trajectories. Everything had to be perfect. And then Fraser ordered the cruiser Jamaica to fire star shells. Seconds later, the night sky above Scharnhorst erupted in brilliant white light. On Scharnhorst's bridge, Bey and his officers had been congratulating themselves on their escape. They thought the worst was behind them. Then those star shells lit up the darkness directly ahead, and every man on that bridge felt their stomach drop. Because there, emerging from the gloom like some kind of nightmare, was the massive silhouette of a British battleship. They'd been running straight toward it for the past hour. Fraser didn't give them time to react. Fire! The night exploded as Duke of York unleashed a full broadside. 10 14-inch guns roaring at once, sending over 14,000 pounds of high explosive toward Scharnhorst. The noise was absolutely deafening, the muzzle flashes turning night into day. For the men on Scharnhorst, it must have felt like the world was ending. Shells screamed through the air and started crashing down around them, sending up massive columns of water. One of those shells found its mark almost immediately. It punched straight through the forward turret Anton, killing everyone inside instantly. The entire gun crew, gone in a fraction of a second. To prevent the ammunition from cooking off and blowing the ship apart, the crew flooded the second forward turret, Bruno, as a precaution. In the span of maybe 2 minutes, Scharnhorst had lost 2/3 of her forward firepower. Bey stood on the bridge, taking in the situation, and the reality hit him hard. He couldn't turn back north because the cruisers were still there, closing in from behind. He couldn't fight Duke of York head-on. His forward turrets were gone. His only option was to run east and hope Scharnhorst's speed could save her one more time. He ordered a hard turn to port, swinging the ship eastward, and commanded the rear turret Caesar to return fire with everything it had. Scharnhorst heeled over as she made the turn, her single remaining operational turret firing back at the British monster. The shells flew wide, disappearing into the darkness. Another British salvo came crashing down, this time smashing into the superstructure and triggering a massive fire that lit up the ship like a beacon. The crew realized they'd flooded turret Bruno for nothing. It wasn't even damaged. Orders went out to drain it and get it back online, but that would take time they didn't have. The ship accelerated to maximum speed, pushing past 30 knots even with the damage she'd taken. Caesar turret kept firing, loading and shooting as fast as the crew could manage, trying to keep Duke of York at bay. But the British battleship was relentless, her radar guiding every shot with terrifying accuracy. Another shell slammed into Bruno just as the crew was trying to bring it back online. The turret filled with smoke, and the men had to evacuate or suffocate. Now Scharnhorst was down to one turret, one last weapon to fight back with. Fraser watched from Duke of York as Scharnhorst started pulling away again. Even damaged, even on fire, that ship was fast. Too fast. The distance between them was growing, and if Scharnhorst made it into the darkness, she might actually escape. Fraser was getting nervous. They'd landed some solid hits, but nothing that would stop her. And then something happened that changed everything. One of Scharnhorst's shells struck Duke of York, and the damage report came back immediately. "Sir, we've lost the radar." Without radar, they were as blind as the Germans. There was no way to track Scharnhorst in the darkness, no way to aim with any accuracy. The ship that had been their greatest advantage was about to slip away into the Arctic night. Fraser's entire plan was falling apart. Unless someone could fix that radar, and fix it fast, Scharnhorst was going to survive. Again, down in the radar room, Lieutenant Harold Bates stared at the dead screen and felt his heart sink. The radar antenna had been knocked out of alignment by the German shell impact, and without it, Duke of York was firing blind. He could hear the main guns still thundering above him, but every second they spent without radar guidance meant Scharnhorst was getting further away. Someone had to fix it. And looking at the damage, Bates realized that someone was going to have to climb the mast in the middle of a snowstorm to do it. He didn't ask for permission. He didn't wait for orders. Bates just grabbed his tools and headed topside. When he emerged onto the deck, the full force of the Arctic storm hit him like a wall. Wind howling at gale force, snow coming down so thick he could barely see 10 feet ahead, and the ship rolling heavily in the massive swells. The temperature was well below freezing. This wasn't just dangerous, it was borderline suicidal. The radar antenna was mounted high up on the mast, which meant Bates had to climb up into the superstructure while the ship was actively engaged in combat. Every time the main guns fired, the blast would shake the entire mast, and the concussion alone was enough to knock a man loose if he wasn't hanging on with everything he had. Bates started climbing anyway. The metal rungs were coated in ice, making every handhold treacherous. The wind tore at him, trying to rip him off the mast. Snow blasted into his face, blinding him. But Bates kept going, one frozen hand over the other, pulling himself upward step by agonizing step. Below him, the gun crews were still firing into the night, chasing an enemy they couldn't see. The fate of the entire engagement was resting on whether this one man could reach that antenna and fix it. Halfway up, one of the main guns fired directly beneath him. The blast wave hit Bates like a physical blow, and for a moment he thought he was going to fall. His grip on the icy metal was the only thing keeping him from dropping onto the deck far below. He hung there, ears ringing, struggling to breathe, but he didn't let go. He couldn't let go. Too many lives depended on getting that radar working again. The wind ripped his hat clean off his head, sending it spinning away into the darkness. Bates barely noticed. He was focused entirely on the climb, blocking out everything else, the cold, the wind, the danger. His hands were going numb, but he forced them to keep gripping, keep pulling, just a little further, just a few more feet. Finally, he reached the radar antenna. It was hanging at a wrong angle, knocked loose from its mounting by the German shell. Bates positioned himself as best he could on the narrow platform, bracing against the wind, and started working on it. His frozen fingers fumbled with the equipment, trying to push the heavy antenna back into proper alignment. Another gun fired below. The mast shook violently, nearly throwing him off, but Bates held on and kept working. With a massive effort, pushing with everything he had, Bates managed to force the antenna back into position. It locked into place with a satisfying click that he could barely hear over the howling wind. He didn't waste time celebrating. He just started climbing back down as fast as his frozen limbs would allow, desperate to get back to the warmth and relative safety of the ship's interior. Down in the radar room, the screen suddenly flickered back to life. Contact. Range, 22,000 yards. The operators couldn't believe it. They immediately called up to the bridge. Radar reports Scharnhorst at 22,000 yards. Fraser's face broke into a tight smile. They had her again. The hunt was back on. 22,000 yards. That's over 10 nautical miles. It was a difficult shot even with radar, especially in these conditions. But it was infinitely better than shooting blind. Fraser wasted no time. Correct and fire, quickly. The gun crews adjusted their aim based on the radar data and let loose another salvo. The shells arced up into the night sky, traveling for what felt like an eternity, about 30 seconds of flight time before coming back down. On Scharnhorst, Bey was still hoping they might make it. The ship was running at 22 knots now, engines straining, and the British fire seemed to be falling behind them. Maybe the storm would cover their escape. Maybe the damage wasn't as bad as it seemed. Maybe their luck would hold just one more time. And then a 14-inch shell punched through the upper belt armor and exploded deep inside the ship, right in boiler room number 1. The explosion was catastrophic. Steam lines ruptured, flooding the compartment with superheated vapor that killed the crew instantly. The boilers went offline, and Scharnhorst's speed dropped like a stone. 22 knots, 15 knots, 8 knots. The ship was barely crawling now, wallowing in the heavy seas. Bey stood on the bridge watching the speed indicator fall, and he knew it was over. Without speed, Scharnhorst was defenseless. The British destroyers would close in for torpedo attacks, and there was nothing he could do to stop them. He ordered a transmission sent out, his last message to German command. "We will fight to the last shell. Long live Germany." It wasn't a request for help. It wasn't a tactical update. It was a farewell. Bey knew he wasn't leaving these waters alive. The engineers worked frantically and managed to get the ship back up to 22 knots, but it wasn't nearly enough. Scharnhorst was wounded, slowing, and completely surrounded. The final act was about to begin, and it all came down to one man's climb up an icy mast in the middle of a blizzard. Harold Bates had sealed Scharnhorst's fate with nothing but his courage and frozen hands. The lucky ship had finally run out of miracles. 22 knots wasn't enough. In any other situation, that would still be considered fast for a damaged battleship, but in these circumstances, it was a death sentence. Scharnhorst needed her speed to survive, to run circles around the British destroyers and keep them at bay. At 22 knots, she was vulnerable, and the Royal Navy knew it. Duke of York continued pounding away from a distance, shells raining down on Scharnhorst with methodical precision. Each hit caused more damage, more fires, more flooding. The ship was being torn apart piece by piece, but the crew kept fighting. Caesar turret, the same turret that had fired the very first shots of the battle hours earlier, kept returning fire. The gun crews were exhausted, working in smoke-filled compartments with the ship shuddering under them, but they didn't stop. Load, aim, fire. Load, aim, fire. They were going to fight until there was nothing left to fight with. Fraser saw the reduced speed and immediately ordered the destroyers to close in. 4 British destroyers, Savage, Samaras, Scorpion, and Stored, began their attack run. This was what destroyers were built for: getting in close, launching torpedoes, and getting out before the target could retaliate. Scharnhorst's secondary batteries opened up, 15-centimeter guns tracking the incoming threats, shells splashing around the approaching destroyers. They managed to hit one, causing damage, but there were too many of them coming from too many directions. 2 destroyers made their charge first, cutting through the heavy seas at maximum speed. They closed to within a few thousand yards, close enough to see Scharnhorst's silhouette lit up by fires, and launched 8 torpedoes into the water. The torpedoes streaked toward the German battleship, leaving trails of bubbles in their wake. One found its mark, slamming into Scharnhorst's hull with a massive explosion that sent a column of water shooting up into the air. The ship shuddered from the impact, taking on more water, listing slightly to one side. Before the damage control teams could even assess what had happened, the other 2 destroyers made their run. 12 more torpedoes launched, cutting through the water toward the crippled battleship. Scharnhorst tried to maneuver, but she was too slow, too damaged. The torpedoes were coming from multiple angles, and there was no way to dodge them all. 1 hit on the port side. Then 3 more on the starboard side in rapid succession. Boom, boom, boom. Each impact sent shockwaves through the entire ship, buckling bulkheads and opening up massive holes below the waterline. The ship groaned under the strain. Water was pouring in faster than the pumps could handle it. The list increased dramatically as thousands of tons of seawater flooded the lower compartments. Speed dropped again. 10 knots now, barely moving. Scharnhorst was dying, and everyone on board knew it. But Bey wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. He ordered the ship to turn, to attempt one last desperate torpedo run of their own. If they were going down, they'd take someone with them. The ship began the turn, struggling to respond to the helm with all the damage she'd sustained. The torpedo crews prepared to launch, but Scharnhorst was too far gone. She could barely maintain steerage. Only 1 torpedo managed to launch, and it missed completely, disappearing into the darkness. It was the last offensive action Scharnhorst would ever take. The British destroyers circled back like sharks sensing blood in the water. They closed in again, this time at point-blank range, so close they could hardly miss. Another wave of torpedoes launched, 5 of them, all aimed at the wallowing battleship. They slammed into Scharnhorst's hull almost simultaneously, 5 massive explosions that lifted the ship partially out of the water. The damage was catastrophic. Massive sections of the hull were blown open, and the ocean rushed in with devastating force. Caesar turret, which had been firing nonstop for hours, finally took a direct hit. The impact damaged the turret mechanism, jamming it in place. The guns fell silent. The crew tried desperately to get it working again, but it was useless. The turret that had been the first to fire in this battle, the last offensive weapon Scharnhorst had left, was finished. The ship had no way to fight back anymore. Water continued flooding into the lower decks. The list grew more severe: 15 degrees, 20 degrees, 30 degrees. The ship was rolling over onto her side, and there was nothing anyone could do to stop it. Fires raged throughout the superstructure. Secondary batteries were still firing at the British ships, crews refusing to abandon their posts even as the deck tilted beneath them. Some of these men must have known they were firing their last shots, that they'd never leave this ship alive, but they kept loading and firing anyway. Bey stood on the bridge, holding onto the railing as the deck leaned heavily to starboard. The ship was going down. There was no saving her now. He'd fought as long as he could, done everything possible with what he had, but it wasn't enough. It was never going to be enough. The mission had been doomed from the start, and now nearly 2,000 men were going to pay the price for decisions made by people sitting safe in offices hundreds of miles away. Bey gave the order he'd been dreading since this battle started: abandon ship. The order to abandon ship echoed through what remained of Scharnhorst's communication systems, but for most of the crew, it came too late. The ship was listing so heavily to starboard that moving around inside was nearly impossible. Men were climbing uphill just to reach the upper decks, fighting against the angle of the tilting ship, while water rushed through the corridors behind them. Some compartments were already completely flooded, trapping crew members who never had a chance to escape. Those who made it topside faced an equally horrific situation. The Arctic Ocean in December is a death sentence. Water temperatures hovering just above freezing meant that even if you survived getting off the ship, you had maybe 15 minutes before hypothermia shut down your body. Life rafts were being launched, but in the chaos and darkness, many men couldn't reach them. Some jumped into the water and started swimming, desperately trying to put distance between themselves and the sinking ship before it dragged them down with it. Bey remained on the bridge as the ship continued its death roll. Reports from survivors suggest he was calm, almost resigned to his fate. He'd done everything he could. The crew had fought with incredible courage against impossible odds. But courage doesn't stop torpedo holes from flooding, and it doesn't bring back destroyed boilers. Scharnhorst was finished, and Bey wasn't going to abandon his post. He stood there as the deck tilted further and further, the ship rolling onto her side like a dying whale. From the Duke of York, Admiral Fraser watched through his binoculars as the German battleship entered her final moments. The ship was almost completely on her side now, her port side facing up toward the sky, fires still burning across her superstructure. It was a horrifying and mesmerizing sight, one of the most powerful warships in the world, reduced to a flaming wreck in the span of a few hours. Fraser felt no joy in it, just a grim satisfaction that the mission was complete. The bow of Scharnhorst dipped beneath the waves first, the weight of the flooded forward compartments pulling that end down. As the bow sank, the stern rose up out of the water, climbing higher and higher until the massive propellers were visible, still turning slowly even as the ship died. For a moment, Scharnhorst hung there, vertical in the water like some kind of monument, before sliding beneath the surface. The time was approximately 7:45 p.m. The ship that had survived so many close calls, that had earned the reputation as the luckiest ship in the Kriegsmarine, was gone. The British ships immediately began rescue operations, searching the dark waters for survivors. But the conditions were brutal. Men were scattered across miles of ocean, many of them already unconscious from the cold. The rescue crews did everything they could, pulling men from the water as quickly as possible, but for most of Scharnhorst's crew, help came too late or not at all. Out of 1,968 men who had been aboard that ship, only 36 were pulled from the water alive. Not a single officer survived. Not one. Admiral Erich Bey was not among the survivors. Some reports claim he was seen in the water briefly before disappearing beneath the waves, though those accounts have never been fully verified. Whether he went down with the ship or died in the freezing water shortly after, the result was the same. The man who never should have commanded a battleship died commanding one, following orders that should never have been given. The aftermath gets even stranger. Months later, 2 more bodies from Scharnhorst were discovered on the Norwegian coast, frozen solid. They'd somehow made it to shore, found shelter, but reportedly perished when a faulty heater in their refuge failed. They'd survived the battle, survived the freezing water, made it to land, only to freeze to death, waiting for rescue that never came. Just another tragic footnote to a disaster that never should have happened. Fraser would later address his crew with words that have become famous in naval history. "Gentlemen, the battle against the Scharnhorst has ended in victory for us. I hope that any of you who are ever called upon to lead a ship into action against an opponent many times superior will command your ship as gallantly as the Scharnhorst was commanded today." Coming from the man who had just destroyed her, that tribute carries weight. Fraser understood that Bey and his crew had fought with everything they had. They'd been brave, determined, and ultimately doomed. 80 years later, the debate still rages. Was Erich Bey a competent commander who did his best in an impossible situation? Or was he out of his depth and responsible for the loss of nearly 2,000 men? The answer probably lies somewhere in between, but that hasn't stopped historians from picking sides. Some argue that Bey made critical tactical errors, detaching his destroyers in a storm, failing to properly prepare his battle group, not being aggressive enough in the initial engagement. Others point out that he was set up to fail from the moment he took command. The evidence suggesting this mission was unwinnable from the start is pretty compelling. British intelligence knew Scharnhorst was coming. They had superior radar technology that could track and target through conditions that left the Germans completely blind. The weather was so bad that coordinating any kind of effective attack was nearly impossible. Scharnhorst was operating alone without the support of Tirpitz or any other capital ship. She was undermanned because of Christmas leave, and commanding it all was a destroyer expert who'd been given the job weeks earlier with minimal preparation time. But here's where it gets really contentious. Some historians claim Bey failed to adequately prepare his battle group for the mission, that he didn't drill his crews enough on battleship tactics, didn't establish proper communication protocols with his destroyers. The decision to detach those destroyers has been particularly criticized. Without them, Scharnhorst had no screen against torpedo attacks, no way to keep the British destroyers at bay during that final assault. Maybe, if those 5 destroyers had stayed with Scharnhorst, they could have driven off the torpedo attacks that ultimately sank her. On the other hand, plenty of naval experts argue that Bey was essentially a scapegoat for failures at the highest levels of German command. Grand Admiral Dönitz ordered the mission despite terrible conditions and ignored Bey's concerns. The decision to replace experienced staff officers right before a major operation was borderline criminal. Sending Scharnhorst out alone, undermanned, with a commander who had minimal capital ship experience, into waters where the British had every advantage. That's not tactics. That's throwing lives away to satisfy political pressure from Hitler. What's undeniable is that the Battle of the North Cape marked the end of an era. It was the last major battleship engagement in European waters during World War II. After Scharnhorst went down, the German surface fleet essentially ceased to exist as an offensive threat. Tirpitz would spend the rest of her life hiding in Norwegian fjords before being destroyed by British bombers. The age of the battleship was coming to an end, and Scharnhorst's final battle was one of its closing chapters. The wreck of Scharnhorst still lies on the bottom of the Barents Sea, roughly 290 meters down in freezing darkness. Occasionally, expedition teams visit the site, documenting the debris field and paying respects to the men who went down with her. The ship is considered a war grave, and disturbing it is prohibited. Nearly 2,000 men are still down there, frozen in time, a reminder of decisions made in warm offices that sent sailors into frozen hell. So was this brilliant British planning or German incompetence? The truth is, it was both, mixed with a heavy dose of technological advantage and some genuinely bad luck. The lucky ship finally ran out of miracles on Christmas night 1943, taking with her almost 2,000 men and one destroyer commander who never should have been there in the first place. And we're still arguing about whose fault it was.